I gotta say right from the start, this is not how I ever envisioned sharing today with you. At the beginning of Lent, we had a really exciting interactive idea that involved tasting foods and stepping back into time. We were gonna experience the drama of Maundy, Thursday, peek our head around the corner to see what was to come on Good Friday. But that's not where we are. Instead, I'm talking to you through a camera with only a few props, none of the food, none of the images that I wanted to share with you. So we have a choice: to change it all, do something else, or share with you, at least in some small portion, what was on our hearts. I bet you can guess where we're gonna land. Stephen Curtis Chapman is one of my favorite artists, and he has a song entitled "Remember to Remember." The song is an invitation to see in the midst of bad and good that God has walked with us. It's important to remember to remember. Not sure about you, but I forget stuff a lot. I have put reminders in my phone all the time. I am thankful for a watch that alerts me, tells me to get going. But I found that only works if I remember to put those things in my phone. Remember is a huge word for us as followers of Jesus, as it was a big deal for the people of God. The people of God that we call the Old Testament. You might say that once you get past the original Exodus story, the rest of the Old Testament is a series of stories that show God's people remembering and forgetting their rescue. That story, the Exodus, is the foundational story of the Hebrew people. And God, the prophets, kings all say, remember. The reason we continue to take communion and these elements is because Jesus said, hey friends, you're going to want to remember this. But why? Because this meal is a story. Sharing in what Jesus was offering those men in that upper room, what he offers us today. And over the centuries, we have come to know this as a holy mystery, an important piece of faith. But some of us may not understand the story that Jesus was telling when he shared that meal. Well, the first thing that we want to note is that Jesus' meal took place in an upper room that had been prepared by a few of Jesus' disciples. This wasn't, what are we going to have for dinner tonight kind of meal. This was an expected meal, an expected menu. While I love Leonardo da Vinci and in the picture that he painted, the room looked nothing like it. In Da Vinci's picture, Jesus sits in the middle of the table. No, that wasn't how you celebrated this meal, or even how people ate in the first century. Instead, they sat on the floor at a U-shaped table called a triclinium. And the host, or the person of honor as you're looking, didn't sit in the middle, but sat the second seat on the far left. They reclined in order to eat, laying on their left hand and eating with their right. And we understand from the Gospel of John that the disciple Jesus loved, who most people think was John, he leaned back on Jesus' chest. That makes sense at this U-shaped table. And it means that John reclined in the first seat. We also know that Jesus said the person who would betray him would be the one that he shared the sup with, the one he dipped the bread into the cup. The person sat on this left, this person immediately behind Jesus. This person was none other than Judas, the betrayer. The two places the seats of honor at the meal. Normally, either the servant of the meal or maybe the youngest person would sit in the very last seat on the far right of the table. In this case, we believe it was Peter. Because at one point, when Jesus speaks of betrayal, Peter motions to John, who is it? The only person John could have seen from that far position, his closeness to Jesus, would have been the opposite side of the table, Peter's position. That also means when Jesus comes to wash the feet, not only had Jesus washed everyone else's feet at that point, but as chief servant, that was supposed to have been Peter's role that night. As they gather for the meal, the disciples begin to argue about greatness. So Jesus shows them what greatness looks like. He wraps a towel around him. He washes each disciple's feet. It's an act of service that sets the stage for the rest of the meal. And as he finishes, Jesus gives them this command: love one another, just as I have loved you. And the rest of the meal becomes how that love is to be understood. Now, the meal had several pieces that always had to be a part. Some of those traditions have grown over the years, but some have stayed the same. Greens, usually parsley, salt water, unleavened or no yeast bread, lamb, a sweet mixture of apples or nuts, bitter herbs, usually horseradish, and most importantly, 4 cups of wine. All of these foods symbolize the freedom from oppression that the Hebrews were given by God from the hand of Pharaoh. See, this is the meaning and the purpose behind the meal. To remember this act of salvation from oppression. This moment of freedom was the defining moment of the nation, a yearly reminder for how God reached down and rescued the people from bondage, slavery. It was something that brought family and friends together, a night of feasting, a night of celebration. And as the Passover drama began, parents and children, hosts and guests would all have parts to play, certain questions and statements to share. Now, part of those statements involved the 4 promises of Passover. These promises are the very heart of the whole event, and they were given to Moses and the people of God. What were they? God said to the people, I will bring you out of bondage and slavery. I will set you free from the yoke of oppression. I will redeem you. I will take you, and I will be your God. Now I can imagine the disciples were ready to relax a bit after experiencing the previous couple days, the palms, the chaos of Jesus racing through the temple, the threats of the religious leaders. By this time, they were looking forward to being still, eating a ton of food, and celebrating God's goodness. As the story begins, the first cup is poured and lifted. And the first promise of celebration is declared. Lord God, King of everything, we thank you for the fruit of the vine. This cup is the first promise, the cup of taking. I will bring you out of slavery, and the meal begins. The story is told. A bit later, a second cup is poured and drank. A cup of promise of freedom. The story of Moses. The Passover meal is begun. As tears and bitterness of slavery are remembered, the crying out of God's people, bread is taken and dipped into those bitter herbs and into the salty water. In the Gospels, this is where Jesus says, someone will betray me. And the crowd goes wild. Who is it? The one I dipped this up with. And he dips and he shares with Judas. Jesus says in this place of remembering the tears of bondage, that betrayal and bondage still exists. Once this reminder has been shared, the meal proper is to begin. A piece of unleavened bread is normally taken and broken. Later years, it was hidden and ransomed or brought back by a child at the end of the meal. But this bread symbolizes that it's time to eat, and that the taste of redemption, a lamb sacrificed for salvation, is now to begin. Jesus takes that bread. He blesses it, and he breaks it. And he says, take and eat, this is my body broken for you. The bread no longer a symbol of what had happened, it is a symbol of what is happening. The lamb they were to eat was now a lamb that was to be sacrificed. The feasting would normally continue for some time, but as things comes to a close, it was time for that third cup. A cup that declares the promise of God, I will redeem you, I will free you. Jesus takes this cup that symbolizes God's covenant, where his people were spared from judgment, and says, this is the blood of a new covenant. It is my blood shed for you for the forgiveness of sins. Instead of a lamb's blood that will spare the Hebrews from the angel of death, it is now his blood that would spare and forgive all of sin. And he says, remember me when you eat this meal. But the meal wasn't over. There was still one cup to drink. Now Jesus said at the third cup, I will not drink of the cup again. This fourth cup, being rescued from Pharaoh, being protected from his rage. And there is no fourth cup. Wait a minute, what? Jesus, you're leaving out the best part, the part where we are free from trial. This is the cup of protection. This is the spot that good Hebrews are waiting for. And Jesus says there's no protection for what is to come. When Jesus stands up and invites the disciples to go for a walk, as they begin walking, someone sings another song, a Hallel, possibly, praise song. They walk along the walls of the city of Jerusalem, and they head for a regular place of retreat, the Mount of Olives. It sits on the eastern side of the city, and from only halfway up, you can see over all of Jerusalem. And here Jesus invites his disciples to continue their Passover celebration in prayer. It was dark, probably cool, and they had been drained from the emotions tonight. They were physically tired. They were everything tired. But Jesus begs them, tarry with me for about an hour. His soul deeply burdened, the full sorrow comes upon him to the point of death, we're told. His words are filled with desperation and ache, and he leaves them to pray. And the disciples end up falling asleep. Jesus goes further into the garden and comes to a spot where he collapses to the ground. And here at the end of this full week, of this full night, Jesus begins to cry out. It is a gut-wrenching prayer in this place. Here, Jesus' humanity is put on full display. In order for this covenant to be ratified, for it to be real, a sacrifice will be needed. And Jesus knows what's coming. It's what he has set his face so resolutely toward weeks prior. You know, I mentioned 4 cups of Passover, but there is one further cup that later became associated with the actual meal. It's spoken of throughout the scriptures by the prophets. It's the cup of punishment. Some call it the cup of God's wrath, God's righteous anger against sin, the punishment for the brokenness in God's creation. And as Jesus prays, he asks, take this cup from me. Does Jesus have in mind the cup of wrath? Does he know that all the consequences of humanity's brokenness are about to be poured out on him? Scripture says he was in such distress that he sweat blood. This isn't anxiety. This isn't stress. This is a deep agony. This is a hurt that few of us know, and yet all of us are aware of it as a struggle for him. In the end, Jesus says, your will, not mine, God. For this is how we will bring them out. We will set them free. We will redeem them. How we will take them and bring them home. I will drink this cup so they never have to. A Passover meal redefined and reestablished. A meal that shows the depth of God's love and promise to the very creation that turned its back on him. A meal that said to the disciples, let me show you what love looks like. Foot washing. Bread that is his body. A cup that now symbolizes his blood shed for the forgiveness of all sin. A walk to a garden where the Savior of the world would be alone, would be in agony, would face his humanity, and would submit to the 5th cup. In the evening, this was a night for him to invite us to remember. Jesus shares with us, the followers throughout the millennia, a whole new way of seeing freedom from slavery and oppression. It's not Pharaoh that enslaves, it's the power of sin and death. And this meal was and is Jesus' invitation to be freed from it all, to be brought out, to be set free, to be redeemed, to be given an eternal family home. The disciples came that night expecting to reenact a Passover meal. Jesus came that night to institute a new Passover meal, a new meal of redemption. This new Passover was about a different kind of freedom from slavery, a different kind of release of change. And this is why, my dear friends, we remember. So friends, while we can't gather and take this communion meal together, I invite you to pause at some point. Remember. With the madness that is surrounding us, with a very different and unholy feeling Holy Week, force yourself, if need be, to remember to remember. My prayer is that these next few days will be filled with the promises of hope, that while it feels like a long night in Gethsemane, like an unending season at Golgotha, Sunday's coming. That hope has been brought to us. And until we gather for that meal, until we celebrate that incredible day, may we remember his sacrifice. Grace and peace.